A boy was sold to a pig farm by his stepfather for only $500 just to pay off his gambling debts. 6 months later, while he was in a casino, 2 men suddenly walked in and the hum of old fluorescent lights buzzed above the looms, blending with the mechanical thud, thud, thud of needles punching thread through fabric. Dust floated in the air, catching on the golden morning light that streamed through the narrow windows of the textile factory. The women worked with heads bent low, their hands moving out of habit more than attention, while the radio played a faint tune from the corner, something old and familiar, just loud enough to be ignored. Mary adjusted the tension on her machine, squinting through her glasses. Her fingers, calloused from years of labor, moved automatically. She didn't need to think much while she worked anymore, which left too much room for thoughts she'd rather not entertain. Eli's cough last night, the rent notice on the fridge, the way Carl had slammed the door that morning without a word. Still, she kept her back straight. Pride had a way of sitting on a woman's spine. The factory floor quieted when Mr. Renshaw, the supervisor, stepped up on the metal steps beside the bulletin board. He tapped the rail for attention. "We've been asked to send 4 workers to the city branch. 6 months temporary assignment. Pays triple plus housing. They're short-staffed up there, and corporate wants it filled this week." There were murmurs. Triple pay meant a lot in their town. It meant groceries without coupons, gas in the tank, and maybe, for someone like Mary, new shoes for her son. Mr. Renshaw read the names. Mary was the second. Her hands froze above the fabric. At lunch, she sat alone in the break room, untouched sandwich on her lap, the paper slightly moist from her thermos. She stared at the wall, then down at her phone. A picture of Eli grinned back, front teeth missing, arms covered in dirt, a plastic dinosaur clutched in his fist. The photo was 2 years old. He'd changed. So had she. The house smelled of boiled cabbage and dryer sheets when Mary walked in, the late afternoon sun slanting across the worn linoleum. Carl sat at the kitchen table, a half-finished crossword in front of him, pencil tapping against the wood. "You're home early," he said without looking up. "They picked me," Mary said, setting her bag down carefully. "For the city job. Starts Monday." Carl looked up now, brows lifting. "City job?" "6 months. It's only temporary. Triple pay. They'll cover lodging too. I could..." She hesitated. "We could finally pay off the car, maybe start saving for Eli's school." He leaned back slowly, folding his arms. "And who's going to take care of things here?" "I thought you could, just for a little while. Eli's almost 11. Carl scoffed. "That boy still sleeps with the hall light on." "Only when it storms," she said gently. A pause. "He needs to grow up," Carl muttered. "Maybe this will be good for him, for both of us." Later that evening, Mary folded laundry in the bedroom. The window cracked open just enough for a breeze to carry in the scent of cut grass. Eli sat on the bed beside her, hugging a stuffed animal faded from too many washes. "I don't want you to go," he whispered. She looked at him, his face still round at the edges. "I know, baby, but it's only for a little while. Can't someone else go instead?" She smiled softly. "They picked me, because I'm good at what I do." He was quiet. Then, "Will Carl be nice to me?" Mary hesitated. She tucked a sock into a folded pair of jeans. "Of course he will. He's your stepdad. He wants what's best for you." The boy didn't look convinced. Carl appeared in the doorway, one hand on the frame. "You two planning a mutiny in here?" "Just talking," Mary said quickly. He entered the room and took the folded clothes from her arms. "I'll put these away. You've had a long day." Mary stood frozen for a beat too long before nodding. When Carl left, Eli whispered, "He scares me sometimes." Mary kissed the top of his head. "He's just tired, like all grown-ups." But that night, long after Eli had gone to bed, Mary sat at the kitchen table, filling out the transfer paperwork. Carl passed by, kissed the top of her head like a stage actor hitting his mark, and poured himself a drink. She didn't say anything. "He'll get over it," he said. "Kids are like dogs. Feed 'em, and they'll come back wagging." Mary's eyes narrowed. "He's not a dog." Carl leaned forward, his voice low and heavy. "You want that boy to have a chance? Then stop coddling him." She stared at her blanket. His tone was not raised, but it didn't need to be. Carl had a way of making words feel like handcuffs, soft, firm, and cold against the skin. "Okay. Take care of Eli. I believe you will help him grow up and become stronger." Mary said, not daring to look Carl straight in the eyes. She thought back to the image of 3-year-old Eli sobbing at his father's funeral. "You're doing the right thing," Carl shrugged. "He'll get used to me." Mary wanted to say something, but the weight of fatigue was stronger than the fire in her chest. She folded Eli's favorite drawing, the one of their house with 3 stick figures, not 2, and slid it into her Bible. At dawn, the bus waited at the edge of town, sighing steam into the morning chill. Mary's luggage wasn't much. The other workers had already gotten on the bus to wait for her. Mary still looked at Eli with longing. She bent down to hug the boy. "Take good care of yourself. Ask Carl if you need anything. He's also your father, your family. Mum always loves you." Eli tried not to cry. The boy rubbed his mother's back and whispered softly, "Goodbye, Mom. I'll miss you so much." Mary kissed Eli's forehead, then turned toward the open door of the coach. She didn't look back. If she had, she wouldn't have left. From the living room window, Carl sipped his coffee and watched her go. The curtain fell back in place. He turned away. The hum of the ceiling fan barely reached the corners of the room. A bulb above the bar flickered once, then gave up entirely, leaving the back wall of Duffy's Tavern in a haze of smoke and shadow. The only light came from a dusty neon sign near the beer taps that buzzed like a mosquito and bathed the room in a sickly red glow. 3 men hunched around a table at the back, their eyes low, their movements quick, like predators too tired to pretend otherwise. Carl sat among them, sleeves rolled, knuckles pale around a tumbler of warm bourbon. His stack of chips had been thicker an hour ago. Now he was leaning forward, jaw clenched, teeth grinding each time the dealer flipped over a card that didn't go his way. "You're bleeding chips, Carl," muttered a man with a diamond earring and a nasal voice. "You might want to step back before the tide takes you under." Carl didn't respond. He stared at the Queen of Spades in his hand, willing it to matter, trying to convince himself that this hand, was the one that would turn things around. But when the river came down a low, indifferent 3 of hearts, the table was silent except for the soft scrape of chips pulled away from him. "Son of a..." Carl slapped his hand flat on the table. The dealer didn't blink. The others barely looked up. In the corner, near the jukebox that hadn't worked since last summer, a large man in a suede jacket rose from his stool. He walked slowly toward Carl, pulling a toothpick from between his lips. "You're $2,000 underwater," he said, his voice like gravel in a bucket. "That's 4 missed payments, Jensen. That's one too many." Carl looked up at him, then back at the cards, like they still held a second chance. The man leaned down. "You've got a week," he said quietly but clearly. 7 days. You show up with the cash, or I come collect in ways you won't like." Carl tried to laugh, but the sound came out strangled. Later that night, the house was still. Mary had left that morning, her scent still clinging faintly to the bedroom curtains. Eli was asleep, or at least pretending to be. The boy had developed that habit early on, Carl noticed. Quiet. Always too quiet. Carl sat at the kitchen table, the same one Mary had scrubbed clean before she left, and stared at the unpaid bills spread out like crime scene photos. He picked up one envelope and held it to the flame of his cigarette, watching the edge curl before tossing it into the sink. From the hallway, a soft, shuffling sound. Eli's feet, probably going to the bathroom. Carl didn't bother calling out. The boy wouldn't look him in the eye anyway. Hadn't in weeks. His gaze drifted to the boy's small shoes by the door, muddy from yesterday's walk to school. Something in his expression shifted. An idea, dark and sharp, took root. The phone call was short. "Yeah, it's Carl Jensen. You still have space at that place of yours?" The voice on the other end was slow, gruff, and calculated. "That depends. What's the job?" Carl's eyes flicked to the hallway, where the bathroom light had just turned off. He lowered his voice. "He's 10, can work hard, eats little, won't talk back." A pause. Then, "Are you offering me a damn dog or a child?" "I'm offering you someone who won't be missed, not for a while." George Miller didn't laugh, but Carl could sense the smirk. 500. Carl didn't hesitate. "Done. You'll take him tonight?" "Too soon. 2 days. I want it quiet. You bring him." 2 days later, the back seat of Carl's truck smelt like hay and gasoline. Eli sat in the corner, hugging a threadbare blanket Mary had left on the couch. His eyes were puffy, though he hadn't cried. Not loudly, anyway. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice so small it barely reached the windscreen. "Somewhere you'll learn how to be useful," Carl muttered, keeping his eyes on the road. Eli looked down at his hands. The drive stretched past rows of fallow fields, the occasional barn half sinking into itself. When they reached George's farm, the sky was dark, moonless. George stood by the fence, a lantern in one hand, his other resting on his belt. The man looked like any other farmer in the county, tall, sun-worn, his overalls clean, too clean. But there was something hollow in his stare, like he'd forgotten how to see people. Eli stayed close to the truck. Carl walked over, handed George a folded envelope, then gestured with his chin. "He's yours now." George opened the envelope and thumbed through the bills. "Are you sure you're not coming back for him?" "I've got nothing to come back for," Carl said. "Just make sure he doesn't run. And for God's sake, don't let anyone see him." George turned to Eli. "Get moving." The boy looked back at Carl, but Carl was already in the driver's seat, the door slamming shut behind him. The truck's engine started, its headlights cut across the weeds, then disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but dust in its wake. And Eli. Small. Still. A rusty wind chime rattled in the breeze, though there wasn't much wind to speak of. Just a restless kind of air that clung to the skin and made everything feel slightly out of place. The porch boards of George Miller's farmhouse creaked with the weight of silence as the night swallowed the last of the headlights. Inside, nothing moved, except for the faint ticking of a clock, too slow to keep real time. George didn't speak as he led Eli around the side of the house. The boy followed in silence, arms still wrapped around the little box Carl had let him take. A shoebox wrapped in brown tape, its corners frayed. Inside was a faded photo of Mary holding him on his 5th birthday, both of them wearing paper crowns. "This way," George said flatly, nudging a barn door open with his boot. The smell hit Eli first, acrid, sour, layered with rot and something sharp he couldn't name. His feet stopped moving. George looked over his shoulder. "Move, or I'll drag you." Eli stepped inside. There were 3 pens lined up against the far wall, each filled with a couple of pigs shifting and snorting in the straw. The barn's overhead light buzzed once and flickered to life, casting a jaundiced glow over everything. In the corner, just past a stack of burlap sacks, lay a mat so thin it barely deserved the name. George kicked it once with his boot, then dropped a tattered blanket on top. "You sleep there," he said. "You eat when I say. You speak only if I ask you something. You work. You keep quiet. That's the deal." Eli blinked, not understanding. George crouched, his voice lower now. "You earn a bed when you're worth it." Then he stood, shut the barn door behind him, and left the boy in the dim hum of the electric light. The days that followed were hard to tell apart. The sky was always some shade of grey, and the sun, when it showed, felt more like a stranger than a friend. Eli woke before dawn to the sound of metal against wood and George's voice barking orders. He hauled feed sacks from one side of the barn to the other. Each one was half his weight, and he had to drag them, leaving trails in the straw. He shoveled waste into a wheelbarrow that wobbled under the load. Once, he tipped it accidentally, and the contents spilled across the floor. George didn't yell. He just walked over and struck him across the back with a plastic broom handle, the sound sharp and clean in the silence. "You spill again, I'll make you lick it up," he said. There were no clocks, no school bells, no cartoons or cereal bowls, just dirt and the sound of pigs snorting and the pressure of George's eyes always watching. Sometimes Eli wasn't even sure if he'd really heard George speak or had just imagined it. He wasn't allowed inside the house. "You stink like pigs," George told him once when he tried to step on the porch for water. "You live where you belong." So Eli drank from the hose. He learned to eat fast when food came, usually leftover scraps or cold beans from a can, and never to ask for more. He washed his hands with hay and wiped his nose on his sleeve. Nights were the worst. The pigs would shuffle and grunt, and the barn walls groaned like they remembered better times. Sometimes, he whispered to the photograph inside the box. He'd hold it close, speaking to it softly, as though Mary could hear from wherever she was. "Maybe you didn't leave me," he said one night, eyes pressed tight, voice trembling. "Maybe you'll come back." George had rules Eli didn't always understand. Don't lean against the fence. Don't whistle. Don't look too long at the trees beyond the property line. One afternoon, Eli paused to rest near the fence after shoveling for hours. His fingers were red and raw. He leaned his forehead against the post, eyes closed. George saw. He didn't speak, just walked up, grabbed Eli by the collar and slammed him against the boards. "You think this is a vacation?" he hissed, breath hot and sour. "You're here to work, not mope." Eli whimpered, tried to nod, but George wasn't finished. "You cry again. I'll make sure your mother disappears." The words hit harder than the slap that followed. At first, Eli didn't believe it. But as days stretched into a dull blur, something inside him began to shift. Mary hadn't come. No one had. Maybe Carl was right. Maybe he had been too much. Maybe she was happier without him. He began to speak less. Not that there was anyone to talk to. The pigs didn't answer. George only spoke when he was angry. And the box, his little box, was starting to feel heavier in his hands at night. Like it held not memories, but weight. Only the sun gave him something he couldn't name. Each morning, a sliver of light pushed through a crack in the barn wall and landed in the straw, warm and gold and indifferent. He started to sit by it when George was out in the fields, just long enough to feel it touch his skin. That warmth didn't ask anything, didn't hit, didn't lie. It just was. And for now, that was enough. After her 6-month contract ends, Mary comes home early, suitcase in hand, eager to see Eli. The house is strangely quiet. Carl appears surprised, then panicked. He tells her, "Eli ran off weeks ago with some neighborhood kids. I didn't want to worry you." Mary goes door to door asking neighbors. Most say they haven't seen Eli in a long time. Her voice cracks as she asks again and again. She prints out missing child flyers and tapes them on telephone poles, her face pale, her hands shaking. Meanwhile, at the outskirts of town, Sarah, a state livestock inspector, receives a report of sick pigs at George Miller's farm and prepares to visit. Jung Nguyen Tuan Bo Kach Yu Kao O Tren Va Viet Noi Tiep Chapta Nam Kung Joan Doi Jai Kong Lap Lai Kach Ting Tiet Ja Viet O Tat Ka Chap Truok. The lunch bell rang late that day, rattling like something out of rhythm. Mary wiped her hands on a piece of scrap cloth, the scent of hot oil and cotton threads lingering on her skin. Around her, the other women shuffled toward the door, their steps weary but practiced, the kind that came from months of repetition. The break room was too small for 12 women, but they squeezed in anyway, some leaning against lockers, others opening their Tupperware in silence. Mary didn't sit. She walked past them to the far end, where the payphone hung on a crooked hook, its cord wrapped in Scotch tape, the buttons slightly sticky. She fished a coin from her apron and slipped it in. She dialed slowly, each number pressed with care, then held the receiver to her ear. The ringing felt longer than usual. "Yeah?" Carl's voice finally came, too loud, like he wasn't expecting anyone who mattered. "Hey," Mary said, her voice light. "How's home?" There was a pause. Then Carl softened it, or tried to. "Well, hey yourself? Things are fine, quiet." "And Eli?" she asked quickly. "Is he nearby? I'd love to say hello if he's not busy." Carl chuckled, too forced, too quick. "He's, just stepped out with the neighbor kid. You know, the Thompson boy. They've been kicking a ball around all morning." Mary frowned. "That's odd. He doesn't usually play without checking in first. Did he?" "Mary," Carl cut in. "He's fine. The boy's adjusting, that's all. He sleeps like a rock and eats everything in the fridge." "You raised him well." A beat passed. The noise of microwaves and soda cans opening echoed faintly behind her. Mary leaned her forehead against the wall. I miss him," she said softly. There was another pause on the line. Then Carl's tone shifted. Brisker. "I know you do, but you made the right call, heading to the city. He'll be proud of you one day." "I hope so," she whispered. And then the line buzzed faintly, and the call ended, not with a goodbye, but with a click that felt far too final. Mary stood holding the receiver a moment longer. The cord swayed gently as she let it drop. She took a step back and opened her wallet, pulling out the tiny photo she always carried. Eli in a school sweater, grinning with 2 front teeth missing, his hair a mess from the wind. She traced the corner with her thumb and blinked fast before slipping it away. Behind her, someone called her name. She turned, forced a smile, and walked back to the factory floor. Back at the house, Carl tossed the phone onto the couch, where it bounced once before sliding onto the stained carpet. He muttered something under his breath, reached for his jacket, and patted down his pockets for the keys. There was no sign of Eli, not a photograph on the wall, not a pair of shoes by the door. Carl had cleared it all out. The silence of the house didn't bother him. If anything, it made things simpler. He got in the truck and pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching over gravel and old cigarette butts. The gas tank was low. He cursed and turned left, not toward the store, but toward the old tavern 2 towns over, the one where nobody asked questions and everybody owed somebody something. Duffy's Tavern hadn't changed. The jukebox still didn't work. The tables still wobbled. The smell of old beer clung to the walls like mildew, and the bartender had a scar across his chin that made him look permanently suspicious. Carl took a seat in the back, ordered a drink without looking at the menu, and slipped into a game before the ice had time to melt in his glass. His hands moved fast, impatient, his eyes flicking up at every turn. He wasn't winning. He never did. Across the table, a man with a face like a closed door leaned back, arms folded. "You sure you want to do this again, Jensen?" he asked, voice calm, almost kind. Carl didn't answer. He tossed another bill on the table and waited for the cards. 3 hands later, he had nothing. Not even enough to bluff. "Damn it," he hissed, slamming the table with the heel of his palm. These cards are cursed." The dealer gave him a look, just a flicker, and began collecting chips. "Don't walk out owing more than you did last week," someone murmured near the bar. Carl stood too fast, knocking his stool over. He grabbed his coat, tossed an empty threat over his shoulder, and stormed out into the parking lot. The night smelled like rust and spilled oil. He leaned against the hood of his truck, breathing hard, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the last of the money George had paid him. He counted it once, then again. It wouldn't last, not at the rate he was going. And for a moment, just a flicker, he looked almost afraid. Then he shook his head, muttered something no one could hear, and drove off again, chasing noise and whiskey into the dark. In her narrow cot, miles away, Mary lay staring at the ceiling, the hum of the factory dormitory all around her, breathing, coughing, someone's radio crackling through static. The blanket felt thinner than it had the night before. Her arms were empty, her hands restless. She reached under the pillow and pulled out the photo again. Eli's eyes were too bright, the smile too certain. It made her ache somewhere deep. "Are you really okay?" she whispered to the still air. But there was no answer, not even the hum of a phone line. 4 months later, the trees had turned brittle and brown. What once swayed with summer now clung to branches like worn-out thoughts, too tired to fall. The sky, pale and reluctant, hung low over the town as Mary stepped off the bus with a suitcase in one hand and Eli's scarf in the other. She hadn't told Carl she was coming back early. There'd been no farewell party at the factory, just a final shift, a nod from her supervisor, and the quiet folding of her apron into a plastic bag. She had taken the earliest bus she could find. Her heart raced the whole way, but in a slow, heavy rhythm, like someone knocking gently on a locked door. The house looked the same from the outside, but something felt rearranged. The curtains hung flat. The porch was littered with cigarette butts. A cracked flower pot sat where Eli's bicycle used to lean. She opened the front door quietly. Inside, it was still. No cartoons playing in the background, no cereal bowl on the kitchen table. Just silence, thick, dry, and uncomfortable. "Carl," she called, stepping into the living room. He emerged from the hallway, shirt wrinkled, hair unwashed. For a brief second, his face registered something close to panic. Then it was gone. "You're back early," he said, forcing a smile. "Didn't expect you till next week." "Where's Eli?" she asked, already setting her bag down. Carl scratched the back of his neck. "Oh, right." Mary narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean, right?" He exhaled hard, as if annoyed by the question. "He ran off, a while ago. Said something about going out with the Thompson boys. That was 3-4 weeks back." Her lips parted, but no sound came. "I didn't want to panic you," he added quickly. "Didn't want to ruin your contract. I figured he'd turn up by now." "You didn't tell the police?" Her voice was rising, shaking. "I looked for him," Carl said, stepping closer. "Drove around the neighborhood, talked to a few people. But you know how kids are. He probably just needed space." Mary backed away from him. "He's 10. The room tilted slightly, like something had come loose beneath her feet. She grabbed her coat and stumbled toward the door. "Where are you going?" Carl called, but she was already halfway down the steps. She knocked on every door within 5 blocks. Most neighbors hadn't seen Eli in a good while. Some didn't even remember when they'd last heard his voice. "I thought you all had moved," one woman offered, drying her hands on a dish towel. "That boy used to wave from the porch, but it's been ages." At the grocery store, Mary approached the cashier, who always gave Eli a red lollipop after school. "Oh, honey, I haven't seen that boy since the summer," the woman said, her smile fading. "I figured he was with family or something." Mary thanked her, but her knees buckled as she stepped outside. She found the nearest bench and sat, her breath fogging up in front of her. For the first time since she had boarded that bus, the thought took form in full. Something is very, very wrong. By that evening, her hands were black with ink. She'd printed the flyers herself at the library, using an old-school photo she kept folded in her wallet. Eli's smile stared up from every page, wide, gap-toothed, and real. Below it, a phone number and her name written in bold ink. Contact Mary Jensen. She taped one to the post outside the diner, another on the community bulletin board near the bus stop. Her fingers shook as she pressed them flat, smoothing the paper against the wood. She passed by the school, the old swings squeaking in the breeze, the chalkboard still faintly marked with spelling words no one had bothered to erase. She stared at the windows, half expecting Eli's face to appear, waving behind the glass. It never did. Miles away, past the edge of town, where the pavement turned to gravel, Sarah Templeton pulled her pickup onto the shoulder of a winding road. She checked the clipboard in her lap, squinting at the scrawl of a complaint. Livestock, exhibiting unusual lethargy. Possible respiratory issues. Farmer George Miller. She glanced at the address again, then out toward the distant property, barely visible through the curtain of dust kicked up by the wind. "All right," she muttered to herself, setting the truck back in gear. The wind had picked up by the time Sarah reached the property. Dust chased her tires like ghosts across the gravel, and the fence posts stood crooked along the perimeter of George Miller's farm, like bent fingers. Nothing moved, except a black crow perched on the roof of the barn. Its feathers ruffled in the wind. Sarah parked beside the gate, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. She'd been to this farm twice before, once for a routine inspection, once for a false alarm. George had always been polite, efficient, quiet. But something about the third call didn't sit right. She slid her inspection kit out of the passenger seat and made her way up the drive. George appeared before she could knock. He must have seen her coming from the fields. He wore denim overalls, crisp and clean, the kind that looked like they'd never seen a speck of mud. His boots were polished, not a drop of straw on his sleeves. "Well, if it isn't the state's favorite watchdog," he said, smiling with just the edges of his mouth. "Come to check on my snorting beauties again." "Third time this season," Sarah said, not smiling back. "Someone's starting to think you're hiding a circus in here." George chuckled. "If I were, I'd charge admission." He stepped aside and waved her in. The barn was warm and strangely still. A few pigs stirred in their pens, but made no real sound. Sarah walked the rows with practiced steps, glancing into troughs, noting feed patterns. Everything was in order, too much in order. "You said they were showing respiratory signs," she asked, crouching near a pen. "They were sluggish yesterday, breathing heavy. Might have been the change in weather." George shrugged. "They're looking better now, though, huh?" Sarah said nothing. She reached down and felt the bedding, freshly laid. Too fresh. She checked the water line. Clean. Too clean. The feed sacks stacked near the back of the barn bore drag marks across the floor, not lift marks. Whoever had moved them hadn't carried them, had pulled them, straining. "You do all this by yourself?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Always have." She looked him over again. Crisp collar, no dirt beneath his nails. "You're busier than you look." He raised a brow. "Are you doubting my work ethic, Miss Templeton?" "I'm doubting your arm strength." George laughed. "Well, I'll be sure to flex next time you come by." She moved on, pausing by a stack of unused barrels pushed against the wall. Something caught her eye. A strap, rubber, frayed, half covered in dust. She bent down and pulled it free. A sandal, child-sized, mud-caked, worn thin at the heel. George saw. His tone didn't change. "Leftover from years ago. Had my nephew visit once. Left stuff everywhere." Sarah held it a second longer than necessary. then slipped it into her bag without asking. "You always keep your doors locked?" she asked casually as they stepped outside. "Bad habit," George said too quickly. The farmhouse sat 20 feet from the barn, its shutters closed tight against the afternoon light. Sarah slowed her steps as they approached. "I don't suppose I could use your bathroom?" she asked. George hesitated. "House is a mess. Pipes are temperamental. I got a shed out back." "Won't take long," she said, brushing past him before he could protest. The door was locked, but the key was in the knob. He hadn't expected company. Inside, the house smelled faintly of bleach and boiled coffee. The furniture was bare, the floor swept clean. Too clean. No dishes in the sink, no photos on the walls. She moved slowly, listening. There, from behind a door at the end of the hallway, barely audible, came a sound like fabric shifting, like someone trying not to breathe. Sarah approached. The door was locked, but not tightly. She jiggled the handle once, and it creaked open. The room on the other side was the kitchen, dim in size, unused, and in the far corner, curled between the stove and the fridge, was a boy. He didn't move when she entered, didn't flinch. His knees were pulled to his chest, arms wrapped tight. His clothes hung off his frame. His face was pale beneath bruises, and one of his shoes was missing. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling. "Are you hurt?" He looked up, eyes wide. But he didn't speak. "My name's Sarah," she added. "I'm not here to scare you. I just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm working," he whispered. "You're working?" The boy nodded. "Helping with the pigs, learning. For my farm in the future." Sarah swallowed. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Eli." The name hit her like a breath held too long. She remembered the flyer she saw in town, the one taped crookedly to the post outside the diner. She hadn't looked at it closely, but she remembered the eyes. Wide. Earnest. "I brought something," she said, reaching into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a pastry she'd grabbed from the gas station that morning, a cinnamon roll, still warm in its paper wrap. She placed it beside him gently. He didn't touch it, just stared at it, as though unsure whether it was real. "I have to go now," Sarah said, standing slowly. "But I'll come back, okay?" Eli didn't answer. But just before she slipped through the door again, she saw it, his fingers twitching toward the pastry, hesitant and trembling. Outside, George leaned against the porch, eyes narrowed. "Found the bathroom?" he asked. "Eventually," Sarah replied. She didn't smile. She got in her truck and drove off down the gravel road, heart hammering so hard it blurred the lines on the clipboard in her lap. The boy had a name, and someone had lied about him. And Sarah Templeton, who had always followed the rules, was about to break every single one. The rain came in sudden, slanting sheets, not a drizzle, not a storm, just that persistent kind of wet that soaked through your collar and blurred your vision, no matter how tightly you pulled the brim of your cap. Sarah stood across the road from George Miller's farm with the truck's engine off and her coat zipped halfway to her throat. She hadn't meant to stay. She'd left the property 2 hours earlier, turned back toward town, even made it halfway to the supply store. But something in her chest had twisted too tightly to ignore. A quiet tug behind the ribs. So she parked at a distance, behind a stand of winter-bitten trees, and waited. Just before dusk, she saw it. The barn door swung open, and George stepped out into the rain, his boots splashing through the mud. He shouted something she couldn't hear, but the sharp edge of it cut through even the downpour. A few seconds later, a small figure emerged, dragging a tarp behind him. Eli. Barefoot, soaked to the skin. He struggled to stretch the plastic across the side of the pen, the wind yanking it from his hands again and again. George watched from beneath the eaves, arms folded, unmoved. When Eli slipped in the mud, landing hard on one elbow, George took a step forward. Not to help, but to yell, "If my pig gets sick again, you'll get beaten up." The boy scrambled up like a dog kicked mid-sleep and kept working. Sarah clenched her hands around the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. Her breath fogged the windshield. She didn't move. Not yet. But something inside her did. Let's take a moment and tell us, if you heard this story from a mobile phone, leave a comment saying, "watermelon." If it was another device, write cantaloupe. And now, let's continue. The following morning, Sarah stopped by the hardware store on the edge of town to grab a new thermometer and antiseptic spray, just enough of an excuse to return. On the way out, she paused at the community board near the exit. Among local flyers for garage sales and missing cats, one particular sheet was curling at the edges, rain-stained and sun-washed. A child's face stared up at her. Wide eyes, crooked smile, a red and blue striped shirt, and beneath it, Eli Jensen, age 10, missing since 4 months ago. Contact Mary Jensen, 555-2614892. She stepped closer, fingers brushing the edge of the flyer. Eli. The boy from the kitchen. The boy behind the locked door. She didn't remember breathing or blinking. Only the sound of her keys as they hit the side of her thigh when she turned and rushed back to the truck. She drove faster than usual, gravel spitting from under her tires, the countryside blurring past. Every bump in the road knocked the image of that flyer deeper into her thoughts, into her chest. She'd been trained to observe symptoms in animals. Weight loss, lethargy, irregular breathing. But no one had trained her for this. For a child who flinched when someone said his name. For a kitchen floor used as a bedroom. For bruises hidden under sleeves too long for his arms. George's farm reappeared at the crest of a hill, its barn slumped against the sky like it was tired of pretending. She parked farther from the house, this time, near the edge of the pasture. Dust settled on the hood of her truck as she stepped out, clipboard in hand. George met her halfway to the barn, his phone pressed to one ear. "Back already?" he said, lifting an eyebrow. "Something wrong with the dosage?" She nodded once, playing the part. "Missed a step in the feed adjustment protocol. Figured it was better to be safe." He waved her off. "I'm on a call with feed suppliers. Go ahead." She didn't wait for him to finish. She moved quickly, the barn swallowing her in its dim quiet. The pigs shifted, but didn't stir. She slipped between them, like shadow. When she reached the back, she veered to the right, through the storage corridor that led behind the pens. It smelled like mold and old water. There he was. Eli sat in the same corner, the paper wrapper from the pastry still lying crumpled beside him, barely touched. His face lifted when she entered, but his eyes stayed guarded, dull. Sarah knelt beside him and slowly pulled the folded flyer from the pocket of her coat. "I want you to look at something," she said. He didn't move until she unfolded it fully and placed it on the floor between them. His breath hitched before his eyes did, and when he finally looked, something cracked. Not loudly, not like a scream or a gasp. It was a quiet, dry sound, like old paper tearing, a breath that didn't make it to the end. "She's..." His voice broke. "She's looking for me." Sarah didn't answer right away. She just watched him as the realization bloomed, slow and painful. "She didn't leave me?" he asked again, quieter this time, like he was afraid the answer would change. Sarah reached for him gently, wrapping an arm around his bony shoulders. He didn't resist. He sank into her like someone who had forgotten how to be held. "She's been looking," she said softly. "She never stopped." Eli's fingers trembled as they gripped the flyer. His tears came fast, hot, and unashamed, soaking into her sleeve, his small chest heaving with each breath. Sarah waited, holding him there, letting him grieve something he hadn't known he was allowed to miss. When his sobs slowed, she reached into her coat again and pulled out a small recording device. She set it on the floor and pressed the red button. "Eli," she said, her voice steady now, "can you tell me what happened? Anything you remember? Anything you want to say?" He nodded, sniffling. "My name is Eli Jensen," he began, his voice trembling. "I was living with my mom and Carl. He gave me to George. Said it was a job. But it wasn't. It's not." He glanced up at her. "I didn't want to stay," he whispered. "But George said if I ran, he'd hurt my mum." Sarah swallowed hard. "You're not alone anymore, Eli. We're going to fix this." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was something close to hope in his eyes. A flicker. Small, but alive. The parking lot behind Miller's feed supply was empty by sundown, just rows of cracked pavement, a sagging chain-link fence, and a few tufts of grass growing where concrete had given up. Sarah waited in the farthest corner, windows fogged from the inside, hands still trembling from the recording in her coat pocket. She'd called the number, the one on the flyer, said her name was Sarah Templeton, that she was with State Inspection Services, that she needed to speak with Mary Jensen. In private. Mary had barely said a word, just asked where to meet. Now, in the dim glow of her dashboard, Sarah saw a woman approaching with uneven steps, part urgency, part fear. Her hair was damp, her coat too thin for the night's cold. In one hand, she clutched something pressed tightly against her chest. Sarah unlocked the passenger door. Mary slid in silently. "I didn't tell him," she said, her voice almost invisible. "Carl. He thinks I went to pick up groceries." Sarah nodded. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small recording device. Without a word, she set it between them and hit play. Eli's voice came through, thin and broken, but unmistakably real. Mary went still, her fingers gripped tighter around the photo she had brought with her, one of Eli from a summer picnic, ketchup on his cheek, grinning in a red plastic chair. The boy on the recording didn't sound like the one in the picture. He sounded older somehow, smaller too. Mary didn't cry right away. Her body shook first, like something inside her had cracked too far to hold. When the recording ended, she stared ahead in silence for a long time. "I thought," she began, but the words failed. She covered her face with one hand. "I thought he just hated me. I thought I did something wrong." Sarah didn't interrupt. "I knocked on every door," Mary whispered. "Printed flyers. Walked for hours until my legs gave out. I kept calling Carl a liar in my head. But I wanted to believe him. I didn't want it to be this." Sarah reached over and gently touched her arm. "You didn't do anything wrong." Mary looked at her. "He's still alive." Sarah nodded. "Barely. But yes." The tears came then, soundless but furious, not from grief, but rage. Mary clenched her fists so tightly the edges of the photo crinkled between her knuckles. "I want that man buried," she said through her teeth, "and I want my son back." "Then we go to the police," Sarah said. Mary's eyes burnt. "Now." At the sheriff's office, the night shift was quiet. One officer sat behind the glass partition, chewing a pen cap while staring at a monitor. When Sarah and Mary entered, he looked up, startled by the urgency in their steps. "Can I help you, ladies?" he asked, half standing. Sarah took a breath. "We need to file a report, a serious one. It involves a missing child and possible abuse." The officer's brow lifted. "You've got a lot of folks making noise about missing pets lately, but if this is another—" Sarah placed the recorder on the counter. "Press play." He frowned, hesitated, then did. The room went silent as Eli's voice filled it. When the tape ended, the officer's pen was forgotten on the floor. "Wait here," he said, his voice suddenly brisk. He disappeared through a side door. Within 10 minutes, a deputy came out with a notepad and a purpose in his stride. Behind him, 2 others followed, one already radioing dispatch. Mary answered every question, gave names, addresses, and timelines. Her voice cracked but didn't falter. Sarah added details: the locked door, the bruises, the boy's physical state, and George's demeanor. She left nothing out. By the time they finished, the mood in the station had shifted. Everyone moved faster, more focused. "We'll coordinate with Child Protective Services, but we won't wait," the deputy told them. "If that boy stays one more night in that place, we'll be the ones in court." "We can't let George catch wind of this," Sarah warned. "He's sharp, cold. If he senses something, he'll run or worse." The officer nodded. "We move before dawn." Mary stood frozen, one hand on the counter. "Can I go with you?" The deputy hesitated. "That's not standard." "I'm not asking for standard," she said. "That's my child in there." After a long pause, he relented. "You stay in the vehicle. The moment we secure the scene, you'll know." Outside, the rain had turned to a light drizzle. The streets glistened, littered with reflections of gas stations and faded brake lights. Sarah walked Mary back to the car. "Get some sleep," Sarah said gently. "It'll be a long morning." "I haven't slept in days," Mary replied, staring straight ahead. "I'll be fine." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need words. And somewhere, not far from where they stood, a boy named Eli lay on a floor of straw, unaware that everything was about to change. The sky hadn't yet shifted from night to morning, but the sheriff's convoy rolled out like a quiet wave. Headlights off, radios muted, tires hissing against the wet road. The town still slept behind fogged windows and drawn curtains, but out at George Miller's farm, something waited. Mary sat in the back seat of the third vehicle, pressed into the corner like she was trying not to exist. Her hands gripped the hem of her sweater, twisting it in slow, repetitive knots. The silence in the cabin was thick, the kind that made every breath feel intrusive. In the passenger seat, Sarah hadn't spoken since they left the station. Her jaw clenched each time they hit a bump in the road. She didn't look at Mary. She didn't look out the window. Her eyes stayed locked on the horizon. The lead car slowed. Lights flared once, then fully ignited. Red, blue, white. The night broke. George was already standing on his porch when the first cruiser rolled up. He squinted against the beams, one hand lifting to block the glare. His expression hovered somewhere between annoyance and disbelief. "What in God's name?" he called, stepping forward. "George Miller," a deputy announced through a loudspeaker. "This is the county sheriff's department. Step down from the porch and keep your hands visible." George didn't move. 2 officers approached, firm and fast. "You got a warrant?" he barked. "We have probable cause and a sworn statement," the deputy replied. "Step back now." "I'm not hiding drugs. This is a goddamn pig farm. And there's a child in your house," the officer snapped. "One you never reported, one who shouldn't be here." George hesitated, just long enough to make Hart stop. Then he opened his mouth to argue, but a second deputy was already pushing past him, motioning others to follow. No, you can't just—" George started, but the cuffs clicked behind his back like punctuation. Sarah stepped out of the vehicle first, her boots crunching over the wet gravel. Her breath came quick, but she steadied it. She knew where to go. She cut around the barn, ignoring the grunts of waking pigs, and made straight for the back. The pen door creaked. The straw crunched. A flashlight beam swept low and slow across the ground. There he was. Eli lay curled on the same ragged mat, arms wrapped around a towel that looked more like shredded cloth than comfort. His face was slack with exhaustion, his chest rising in soft, uneven pulls. The bruises were faded now, but still there, like forgotten fingerprints. The light landed on his face. He flinched, sat up fast, eyes wide and wild. But then, "Eli!" Mary's voice cracked from behind the deputy as she stumbled forward, breathless. "It's me. Mommy." He froze, like something inside him paused to make sure it wasn't a trick. Then the towel slipped from his hands. He let out a sound that had no shape, part cry, part scream, part animal grief, and launched toward her. "Mommy!" His voice shattered through the night, like glass. Mary dropped to her knees in the straw, arms wide, and he collided into them with all the weight of a child who'd held too much alone. They stayed there, mother and son tangled together on the barn floor, wrapped so tightly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Eli clung to her like she might vanish again if he let go. Mary rocked him, whispering over and over, "I'm here. I'm here. I've got you." One of the officers turned away, blinking fast. Sarah stood just outside the doorway, hand over her mouth, eyes shining. A single tear broke free and slid down her cheek, carving a silent trail through the dirt clinging to her skin. No one spoke. The barn was still. But in that stillness, something shifted. A tether, pulled taut for months, had finally found its anchor. George didn't say a word in the back of the cruiser. Not when the doors slammed shut. Not when they read him his rights. His eyes stared ahead, blank, as though he didn't understand the noise around him. He wasn't the center anymore. He was just the man in handcuffs. Later, as dawn pushed pale light through the low-hanging clouds, Sarah watched the ambulance doors close gently behind Eli. He was wrapped in a blanket 2 sizes too big, but he hadn't let go of Mary's hand the entire time. She watched them drive away, standing by her truck, arms crossed tightly across her chest. A deputy came over, nodding once in quiet gratitude. "We don't see endings like that very often," he said. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. The clatter of poker chips echoed through the haze of cigarette smoke at Murphy's backroom bar. Carl sat hunched at the end of the table, half drunk and all nerves, cradling his last losing hand like it held an apology. "Raise or fold, Jensen," the dealer snapped, not unkindly. Carl reached for his whiskey instead. A door slammed open, heavy boots on linoleum. A voice, steady, clipped. "Carl Jensen." He looked up, blinking slowly. The men around the table froze mid-hand. 2 deputies stood in the doorway. One had cuffs already unhooked from his belt. Carl opened his mouth, closed it. "For what?" he finally managed, weak and sour. "Child trafficking. Fraud. You can ask your lawyer about the rest." Carl laughed, short and high, but no one laughed with him. The courthouse smelt like paper, old wood, and nerves. It took 3 weeks to build the full case, but the trial itself was swift. The evidence against George and Carl, photographs, recordings, medical reports, and testimony, landed with the weight of steel. George was first. He sat in silence during his hearings, staring at nothing, blinking only when prompted. His attorney tried to downplay the abuse, suggested confusion, overwork, even psychological instability. But the jury wasn't moved. A doctor testified that Eli's malnutrition levels aligned with those of children from long-term famine zones. Photos of his bruises were displayed on a projector screen large enough that even the jurors in the back leaned away. Carl's defense was thinner. His lawyer argued manipulation, financial desperation, and poor judgment. But the recording of Eli's voice, trembling as he named both men, drowned every excuse. Eli sat beside Mary on the witness bench. He was cleaner now, federal. But his hands still shook, and he still glanced over his shoulder between every question. When they asked what he remembered, he spoke slowly, gripping Mary's hand. "Carl told me if I ever made noise, I wouldn't see my mum again. George told me the same." "Did you believe them?" Eli nodded. "I thought I did something wrong." The courtroom stilled. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Carl Jensen, guilty of child trafficking, fraud, and willful endangerment. George Miller, guilty of unlawful child labor, aggravated assault, and psychological torture. Both were sentenced to 25 years without parole. Additionally, the court ordered $1 million in damages to be placed in trust for Eli, money that neither man would ever personally hold, but that Eli could access when he turned 18. No applause followed the ruling, no gasps, just quiet breathing and the faint rustle of people standing at once. Mary gave her statement later that afternoon, outside the courthouse. She didn't speak of Carl directly, not at first. Instead, she thanked the officer who'd answered her at the station. Thanked the social workers who came in the early morning. Thanked Sarah Templeton, who stood beside her in a plain blouse and jeans, no makeup needed. When the reporters pressed for a comment about Carl, Mary's expression didn't change, but her words sharpened. "There are two kinds of evil," she said. "The kind that hides behind barns, and the kind that eats dinner with you for years." Carl tried to approach her once. In the hallway outside the courtroom, cuffed, led by guards, he called her name. "Mary, please." She didn't stop walking, didn't look back. By evening, the story had spread. Local channels ran the footage under words like betrayal, rescue, and miracle. Photos of George and Carl side by side, mugshots blurred with the faint flicker of courtroom lights. One shot showed Sarah standing outside the barn as Eli was lifted into the ambulance, her face caught in a quiet kind of devastation. The town, once unaware, now couldn't look away. Grocery clerks whispered about the trial. Cafes replayed the news loop. And in the silence that came after the headlines, two names rose. Mary Jensen, Sarah Templeton. Not victims, not martyrs, just women who refused to let silence win. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen that hummed when the refrigerator kicked on. But it was clean, warm, and, most importantly, quiet. The city below moved in its usual rhythm. Horns, distant trains, the occasional bark of a dog bouncing between alley walls. But from their 3rd-floor window, Mary and Eli lived in a different tempo. Slower, softer, rebuilding. Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing. Crayons rolled lazily to the side as he leaned in to color the sun with an orange that looked more like fire than light. A small farmhouse stood in the corner of the page. No fences, no pens. A boy waved from its porch. "Are those pigs?" Mary asked, folding laundry on the couch behind him. He nodded. "But not the mean kind. These ones play tag." She smiled, not at the drawing, but at the way he said it. Without hesitation, without fear. Mary had started working again, part-time at a sewing shop tucked between a bakery and a bookstore. The hours were gentle. The women there were older, soft-spoken, and never asked more than she could give. They left her space to exist. Some evenings, she would come home to find Eli at the window, not watching traffic, but clouds, counting them, naming them, learning the shapes again. One Sunday morning, as they walked home from the market with a paper bag of apples and bread, Mary paused at the edge of the sidewalk. Sarah's truck pulled up slowly to the curb. "I brought that book I told you about," Sarah said, stepping out. "The one with the illustrations from the shelter kids in Vermont." Eli looked up at her shyly, then offered something that was once unthinkable. He smiled. A small one, crooked and fleeting, but it was there. He took the book, then retreated upstairs, letting the door swing closed with a gentle click. Mary lingered. "He's sleeping through the night now," she said. Sarah nodded. He looked better, less curled in on himself. They stood quietly, the kind of silence only women who had witnessed too much could share. Mary turned toward her friend, her voice steady but waited. "We're not staying." Sarah blinked. "What?" "I'm taking him further into the city. New place, new school. No reminders. You don't have to leave." "I do." Mary's gaze didn't waver. "Every time he hears the word barn, he freezes. Every time he sees a man in work boots, he pulls at my sleeve. I can't undo what was done, but I can choose what surrounds him next." Sarah didn't argue. She simply placed a hand on Mary's shoulder. "Promise you'll keep in touch?" "Always. We will be grateful to you forever. And Eli would love to show you his new painting." The move came quietly, without announcements. No one in town was told where Mary and Eli went. The bakery clerk missed seeing them. The school secretary noticed the unclaimed student file, still sitting on the corner of her desk. But for Mary, the city meant anonymity, a chance to walk down streets without second glances. For Eli, it meant a school where no one asked what happened, where the past didn't follow him through every recess bell. In their new apartment, Eli taped his drawings to the fridge. More farms, more sunshine, fewer shadows. Sarah, meanwhile, took on more than she expected. The media attention following the trial had lifted her name to places she never wanted, but couldn't ignore. She was promoted to director of the Regional Veterinary Health Unit. Her face was now on newsletters and department announcements. But the title wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the corner office she requested be converted into a second function. A learning center. A room with art supplies, books, soft chairs, and soft light, made for kids like Eli. She called it the quiet room. One afternoon, as she was pinning up a new bulletin about community services, she looked at the wall across from her desk. A single frame hung there. Inside it, a missing child flyer. The paper had faded slightly. Water damage had blurred the lower edge. But Eli's face, that tentative smile, the too big sweater, still stared out. Below it, the contact line. Mary Jensen, 555-2614892. She never took it down. It reminded her what mattered. It reminded her that some mothers don't stop looking, and some women don't stop fighting. Even after the barn doors are kicked open, even after the cameras go away, especially then. Eli's story may have found its ending, but children like him still exist. Inside, in fear, waiting for someone to hear the quiet cry behind their eyes. Not all of us are called to be heroes, but sometimes it only takes a glance, a question, or a quiet act of courage to change a life forever. Have you ever seen a child who seemed lost, withdrawn, or afraid, and didn't know what to do? If a moment like that appeared before you, would you walk past, or would you stop and ask, "Are you okay?" We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you do? Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If it's already summer where you are, bring an umbrella or a hat when you go out. UV rays are very harmful to the skin. And if it's already dark, go to bed early and rest your eyes. We wish you sweet dreams. See you in the next videos.